We see that a lot of organizations have an EDI office or an EDI committee, but it's important that the right people in those committees in order for change to happen. And it's also important for senior people within these organizations to really listen and not just look at it as an exercise.
Hi there. Before you continue in this second part of our Equity and Diversity in Research bonus episode, I urge you to listen to the first part if you haven't already done so. If you have, welcome to part 2. This is your Digital Mentor podcast. I'm Dr. Christine Boynette from the Wellcome Sanger Institute. This last interview was planned to be in part 1, but so many great points were raised in this interview that we couldn't bear to cut anything out. Hence, we have part 2. Dr. Alice Matimba, whom you heard from in previous segments, will be interviewing Dr. Sahar Ahmed from the Wellcome Sanger Institute and Professor Ijeoma Uchegbu from University College London about the importance of equity and diversity in research institutions. Here's Alice.
Welcome to your Digital Mentor. So I'm your host, Dr. Alice Matimba, based at Advanced Courses and Scientific Conferences at the Wellcome Genome Campus. In this segment of our Equality and Diversity episode, we'll be discussing issues around equality, diversity and inclusion with a special focus on race inequality in academic and research organizations in the UK. So as you're all aware, due to the recent events about racism, inequalities and discrimination, several organizations in the UK have openly acknowledged this as a problem in academia and research and have further taken steps declaring their commitment to addressing this complex challenge. To get into this discussion, we are joined by two distinguished guests, Ijeoma Uchegbu from UCL and Sahar Ahmed from the Wellcome Sanger Institute. So before we dig deep into our discussions, please could you briefly introduce yourselves and tell the audience what you do?
Hi, I'm Ijeoma Uchegbu and I'm a professor of pharmaceutical nanoscience at UCL. So what does that mean? It means I teach pharmacy undergraduate students and they graduate as pharmacists. I also teach master's students that are doing masters in pharmaceutical sciences. And I also do research, and our research is all about drug design and drug development using nanotechnology. And the biggest thing that's come out of our lab is a pain therapeutic, which we out-licensed to an American company, and that's now being developed in the US. It's being clinically developed. And what we did is that we took enkephalin, which is in everybody's brains, and we made it druggable using a polymer we created in our lab.
So I'm Sahar Ahmed and I'm Head of Equality, Diversity Inclusion for Genome Research Limited, which includes the Wellcome Sanger Institute. So I lead the organisation's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion programme of work and also lead on associated charter marks and equality accreditation schemes, for example, the Athena Swan Charter, Race at Work. As part of my role, I develop and articulate our vision, strategy and action plans. And I'm responsible for helping to influence and make changes to policies, practices and provisions that can disproportionately disadvantage minority groups. I have a science background. Many years ago, I completed a PhD in physics. So I have, some first-hand experience of the challenges of being an Asian woman in a discipline that is very male and very white, having studied in the UK.
Interesting background. So obviously I'm interested in hearing more about some of your experiences. In fact, I pursued my career on 3 continents. I studied in Africa, in Europe, and in the USA. And for much of the time, I was, always one of few people of color. And in fact, in whole departments or whole faculties, which was obviously quite daunting and had major difficulties, which I think in hindsight might have benefited from having sort of appropriate personal skills and support to deal with them, or even just having networks. I think, everyone's talking about getting together, BAME networks and that kind of stuff. But I'm particularly interested in hearing from you, Ijeoma. You've obviously quite an accomplished academic and top university researcher, inventor, winning awards. And I'm curious to know, how has this journey been for you, being an African woman in an environment where you see less and less people who look like you?
It's a question I'm often asked. And I think in the early part of my career, so I did my first degree in Nigeria and then came and did a PhD in the UK. And I'm often asked, how did you manage to sort of go through the system that we have now, which is obviously, an institutionally racist system and, of course, misogynistic as well. And I always answer this question by saying, well, when I started out as a PhD student, my life was really hard. And it was really hard because I was a single parent. My marriage had broken down and I was a single parent of 3 young children. The youngest was 1, the oldest was 8. And so that was a difficult thing already. And you know what? If you can go through that and get your PhD within the allotted time, I started in March 1991 and did my viva in April 1994. So I didn't overrun because I couldn't overrun because then I'd run out of money. So if you can do things like that, there are a lot of other things which then are relatively trivial to sort out. You know, it's very difficult if you're trying to be a scientist and you're trying to fund your lab and you get lots and lots of disappointments. And I often feel that actually, if you don't get disappointments, you're not reaching. But one thing I tend to do is I always go back and say, well, what did I do wrong? Tell me what I did wrong so that next time I'm not going to make that same mistake. It serves 2 purposes. First of all, you do learn and you realize that you're not that great anyway and you can make mistakes. And it's very important to acknowledge that, irrespective of race and everything. We all blunder and think we know things when we don't quite. But the other thing is, just supposing that you had a perfect application, by the time you ask that question and they get your application next time, they know they have to look at it with due care and attention because you'll be back asking, what did I do wrong? Where did I go wrong? And so it's important then to work from the premise that life is hard. And because life is hard, nobody owes you anything. And so you have to grab everything you can, take disappointment in your stride. I always say that my life as a single parent doing a PhD prepared me for that. Experiments wouldn't go well, but you go home, you've got other challenges. You've got to help your children with their books and reading. You've got to make sure they've got shoes to go back to school in the autumn. You know, these kind of things worry you so much that you're not really worrying about the fact that all the mice actually didn't quite survive that treatment that you thought was your last chance. It's bearing in mind that life is hard and having experienced life being hard, being really dirt poor. And then these other things, you just take them in your stride and try your very best to tackle them one sort of disappointment or one sort of mountain or hurdle at a time.
Wow, that's really enlightening. Power to you. And I guess, you know, having challenges helps you to become more resourceful in coming up with solutions. And Sahar, so what have your experience been, you know, being of Asian background? And, you know, what have been your personal motivations for championing a lot of these EDI projects? I understand you've been working at a national level even, and in your professional role currently.
Well, I think having some lived experience has really coloured my view of how inequalities can exist, like sometimes beneath the radar as well. My parents came from Pakistan in the late 60s, early 70s. And so, you know, we didn't have a lot of money, and growing up, I think it was just drilled into us that we had to work hard. And I think that's actually just been a really important tenet in my life. I have to work hard because nothing is going to be sort of handed to me on a plate. And I think my strong work ethos has come from my family and them having high expectations of how we performed educationally as well, actually. It was always drilled into us that education is important. Growing up in the UK in the 80s and 90s, I was incredibly fortunate. I didn't have to pay university fees. I actually received a bursary to go to university as well. And I think that's really important. It just meant that money wasn't such a big barrier because there was support available. I mean, I think that it's very difficult now for students having to make quite big life decisions at the age of 18 and coming out of university with huge debts. And I think the intersection with socioeconomic considerations as well is massive. When we look at sort of like data, we can see that certain populations will have higher social deprivation as well. And I think it sort of all plays into part and parcel into the sort of inequalities that just become heightened and broadened as people progress through their lives. When I was at school, I was pretty bright, I was encouraged, but, you know, not massively encouraged. It sort of had to still come from me. And going to university, doing physics, in a university actually department had very few women, and actually very, very, very few people of colour, if any. To be honest, when I think back, I mean, this is like 20 years ago, I graduated now, I don't think that there was actually anyone on my course. For me, I had to find strength from within myself. I had good family support, I had like good friends, and I was very determined to do well in academia. And I think doing a PhD is still seen as, a great sort of recognition of one's sort of academic work. And I'm really proud that I've done that. But I also knew halfway through my PhD that this wasn't a space where I belonged. I sort of did it and I was very determined to finish, but I knew that I wasn't going to stay within academia actually as a researcher pretty much like a year into my PhD. It just wasn't that sort of like welcome environment. I started work in sort of equality diversity after my PhD. It was my first proper job after. So I don't know if I almost like fell into this sort of work, but it just means so much to me. And 15 years later, it's still something that I'm so passionate about, but I'm still learning as well. There's so much to kind of discover in this space and so many people to listen to. And I feel incredibly privileged that I do have a role now where I can actually, try and influence the way that our organisation works and thinks. And I'm incredibly proud of that.
You've already answered the question I was going to ask, which whereby whether you saw yourself in this job, or did you even know about these kinds of jobs when you were doing your PhD? So I guess you do just fall into jobs, don't you? I'm interested in, just hearing from both of you some of the barriers to career progression amongst Black, Asian, minority ethnic group people. And obviously this is what we'll cover a lot in today's discussion. So when I was doing, my research around this topic, I came across a very interesting article that comes from the university and college union. They did a study exploring perceptions and experiences of doctoral students in the UK. It was interesting. The findings were that the survey participants were quite committed to wanting to follow through academic or research careers. Yet, we also hear that a lot of people then fall out of the way. And, by the time you get to senior research level, senior academic level, there are fewer and fewer people. In the study, they did mention that, people then, they find it harder to stay in academic. Maybe they have to go and work in a proper job where they can get money to look after their families and so forth. So what do you think about this? I know it's a very pertinent discussion currently. What are your views around this issue where students or researchers fall out? They find it difficult to stay in research and academia.
One thing we have to bear in mind, and it goes back to what I said earlier, that life is hard. Now, a statistic I saw, which really surprised me, was that only 3% of my PhD students will go into academia. So we probably have in our department 200 PhD students at any one time. And we probably recruit into academic positions 2 people a year, sometimes 3 over 2 years. So the point I'm trying to make, first of all, there's a very sharp funnel. And there being a very sharp funnel means that it's very difficult. It wasn't as sharp. It was hard to get an academic position. My first academic position was in Scotland. So I finished my degree in London. I couldn't get the position in London at the School of Pharmacy at the time. But then I applied to Scotland in Glasgow, Strathclyde University, and I got the position. I couldn't believe it. I remember asking my then head of department, was I your first choice? Because I went into it completely underconfident. And he said, yeah, of course, everybody wanted you. And, it took me a while to believe it wasn't just flannel. So it's very, very hard, first of all. Now, if you see it's very hard and you can't afford to take on these unpaid internships, so we have people come into our lab, they're doing an Erasmus program, or they just want to work for 6 months because they've got family money. So there are those barriers. That's one thing we must understand about going in. But then it's even harder to get funded. Women are less likely to get their research funded, and BAME researchers are less likely to get their research funded. And you can see sometimes the research councils are desperate. They have anonymous competitions where we don't want your name or any of your details for that first sift. And then let's get the best ideas before we send them out to review, because they know that there is a bias, inherent bias in the system. Why is there an inherent bias? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you are a really good scientist and you are a white male, you're more likely to get ahead. So you're more likely to review, and you're more likely to review and believe the voices of people that are like you. And I think that I slipped through the net, because in the early days, they used to refer to me as he. His work, his ideas. I remember my first EPSRC grant, I got it in 1999. it was all about me being a he. Some people look at my name and if they're not familiar with Nigerian names, they say, well, that first name looks a bit Japanese. I would tell you that I probably slipped through the net in the beginning, but then you build up your profile and you're more likely to get funding. So if you then are an ethnic minority, there are not many people like you doing reviews and doing panels for fellowships, then it's a lot harder. It's just simple human bias. I'm not even going to say that the people sitting on the panels or doing the reviews are racist. They're kind of looking to promote people that are like them. And occasionally there will be the odd racist. Don't get me wrong. If you're a young researcher, you've done your PhD, I mean, Sahar, you said you decided absolutely not, this wasn't for you. And making that decision, for me, that's okay. If you decide this isn't for you, because it is difficult. And a lot of people get frustrated and then they leave or they don't get past senior lecturer. So it's okay to make that decision. But also what I'm annoyed about is someone who really wants this to be their career, who is passionate about it, and then gets stopped in their tracks. Those are the ones that really annoy me. And we're doing some things at UCL in that we have programs, and this program is the Inclusive Advocacy program, where you have a senior person take on a grade 7, that's like a lecturer position, and you work with them for 2 years to ensure that they apply for promotion. So it's about letting them into the secret garden to see what's behind the door, exposing them to committees, making opportunities for them, because we know that everybody doesn't have the same social capital. So it's leveling the playing field. We know that, for example, if you are a young Muslim woman, you're not going to go to the pub after work and have a drink with the boys. And so when they're talking about their latest ideas, you miss out. So we say, well, everybody doesn't have the same social capital. We're going to give you artificial social capital in the form of this advocate. And you know what? I met these protégés. They were like, oh my God, this is the first time anybody cares about my career. And the best thing is that one of them, she's in professional services, has already got promoted. She did it in 1 year. She had this inclusive advocate who took her around to committees, introduced her to senior people, and she got a grade 8 job.
Wow, that's really amazing and really interesting. I guess other organizations can learn a lot from this. And
it's understanding it's difficult for everyone, but it's doubly difficult if there are people that don't share your cultural background. We're trying to iron out that, and we'll never have a silver bullet that solves this problem. If we can get a critical mass up there, then people coming later that really want academic careers, they can then take them up.
I also noticed that there was discussions around the network. So that idea of networking is really important. But like you said, not everybody has access to the same networks and people as well. Yeah.
I think sponsorship as well. There's so much sponsorship that happens that some of it might not even be sort of conscious sponsorship, but it's about, people will, we sort of have in groups and out groups. If someone is like you sort of see yourself somehow reflected back. You'll just sort of take them under your wing and perhaps, sort of introduce them to those like really important people or bring them along to the next really, important meeting and provide them with the networking opportunities. And sometimes it's not necessarily conscious. You're just thinking, well, actually, I remember how it's difficult for me. I'll just sort of help them a little bit. But actually what can happen, it's just, you're just providing opportunities for the same people. So someone who is not like you perhaps will end up spending less time with them because you feel that you haven't got anything in common or you haven't got anything to say. So it's just easier not to say anything to them. And I think actually that sort of sponsorship can have a hugely positive impact on people's careers. Someone who's kind of talking about you in a positive way when you're not in the room and someone just advocating for you. So it sounds great what UCL's doing around this inclusive advocacy, actually.
And the great thing is that we're beginning to see results. These protégés, they're all super bright, super ambitious. When I met them, I thought, thank God that we have introduced this for this particular crop of people. Because the truth is, when you get disappointed, you become bitter and you withdraw within yourself. And at some point, we don't know when, but then you stop trying because it's just exhausting. So when I met these people and they were all still fizzing, I was like, oh, I'm so glad we caught them early.
Yeah. So is this some kind of, mentoring type people? Are they sort of mentoring these proteges.
What we've done, we call it the Inclusive Advocacy Scheme. And the advocates themselves are just senior people. And they are, various types of people. They're white women, white men, BAME women and BAME men. But they've decided that they want to give something back. And they're having meetings with their proteges and taking them to high-profile meetings, but introducing them to people. So then they can showcase their brilliance to someone who may get their application or be in the room when they're being discussed, as you said, Sahar, and say, well, I've met her or him. Hopefully it's a her. And she's absolutely brilliant. And the whole room changes. This person who we regard as God has just said she's absolutely brilliant.
Absolutely. I think that's a very good point. I mean, it's all about who you know and, the networks that you're associated with. And it sounds like an amazing program. It's great that you have people that are actually committing their time to doing this. So moving on, I just wanted to, just bring also this headline that I saw the other day, which was emphasizing that for BAME, the glass ceiling is not only double glazed, it may be triple glazed. And I thought that was quite, I get the impression that obviously BAMEs probably struggle to get past a certain stage in their careers. What do you think when you find yourself sitting there with not moving on? What do you recommend one should do?
I've had some fantastic people who have supported me in my career, actually. And even that first opportunity that I mentioned, I was straight out of a PhD. The person who hired me, he was a white man. He just saw something in me that he thought would be worth him taking a risk in terms of offering me that opportunity. And subsequently, there have been a couple of people who've just been absolutely fantastic. And I guess sort of doing that sort of advocacy piece as well, I suppose.
So how do you find these people? I mean, the question is, sometimes if there's a formal program that people can be directed to. But if you're in a place where maybe those kinds of programs don't exist.
I think this was it was luck. They weren't formal programs. I think both of those two people, they really firmly believed in inclusion and they led by example. And I think that was absolutely key. They saw that I was, relatively junior Asian woman and wanted to help support me with my career prospects. And I think that more often than not, these formal programs don't exist, but it doesn't mean that there aren't good, supportive, inclusive leaders within your own organisation. So in that case, I would suggest just reaching out to people and just starting to build relationships, because what's the worst that someone can do? They can just ignore your email. It's not going to be the end of the world, because I think more often than not, people are willing to help.
I agree. I mean, I think that when you encounter the glass ceiling, it is incredibly painful. I've had, young women come into my office that when I applied, and the person that got it, he wasn't as good as me and things like that. I always say that what you should do, and I've had my own disappointments. I've gone for a senior position or a leadership position and I didn't quite get it. And what I tend to do is I really do that feedback thing. Can I come and sit opposite you and you can tell me where I went wrong? And that's really important, because if it's genuine, the person wants to help and tell you about the deficiencies. I'll give you a good example. I'm Pro-Vice Provost for Africa and the Middle East at UCL, which means I cover that region when it comes to external engagement. I applied for the job the first time. I went for the interview and I didn't get it. It went to a white man. But you know what? I didn't decide that I'm going to set UCL alight or anything like that. I went to the person who turned me down and I said, let me know where I went wrong. And it was really constructive feedback. Then I met the guy who got the job as well. And he was a great guy, a lot of accomplishments. When it was advertised again, I was now more prepared. I'm not going to make the same mistake twice. So I went in, and the biggest feedback I got, because we just joined UCL from the School of Pharmacy, we merged, was that you don't know UCL well enough. So you made mistakes in your interview when you were talking about UCL. So then I decided, right, I've got to know UCL. I've got to have a plan of what I'm going to do that fits in with the strategic plan of the university. And then I went for the second interview a couple of years later and got the job. So my recommendation is exactly like Sahar's. You have to find someone who is quite willing to give you honest feedback on your application, or you have to find someone who, and you say to them, can you help me? I'm going for this particular position. Can you give me a mock interview? And you'll find people are flattered. By the time you say to someone, I think you're absolutely brilliant, I just love your career and you're amazing, I want to be like you, they'll be more than happy. And I've had colleagues across the university, you're going for a program grant, they give you a mock interview, you're going for a high profile interview for a position. They actually say to you, well, these are the things you should bear in mind. But you have to be able to ask. And the problem with asking is as you said, Sahar, people are worried that people are going to say, no, I'm not interested, or that they'll ignore you. Well, if they ignore you, move on to the next person. You're bound to find someone who reads your email or takes your phone call and thinks, you know what, I'm going to do this and I'm going to throw my heart into it to make sure you do the best you possibly can. Those people exist.
I think having a plan, so sort of connecting with someone and having a plan in terms of what you would want from that relationship can also be quite helpful.
Great. So, just talking again about, some of the issues around inequality discussion. So there's obviously a curious focus on covert racism and microaggressions, some things that maybe you might have experienced that you feel difficult to pinpoint what's happening. Obviously, unless you become self-aware and recognize what's happening and you're able to manage the situation. So sometimes in the work environment, maybe you feel like you're not quite given the same level of respect. You're not as your, white colleagues or your male counterparts. Decisions that you make or your leadership abilities are questioned all the time. Your contributions are undervalued. This impacts on your confidence and then impacts on your performance. And, I'm explaining something that has happened to me on several occasions that I have to sort of snap out of it. How have you dealt with this? How have you experienced it and how have you dealt with it?
For me, if those kind of things happen, I tend to sort of challenge them head on. So you're in a room, you say something, then someone else says it and they say, yeah, that was brilliant, well done. And I say, well, hang on, I said it first. So I challenge it there and then and deal with it there and then. It doesn't win you friends because, okay, we were having a quiet conversation and then suddenly you've chirped up. I've done it many times. And sometimes actually other people in the room look at you as if, didn't you just say that? And this person's mansplaining. That's how I tend to deal with it. When I want to talk about racism and I want to talk about race equality, I focus on just one thing, staff and student attainment. That's all I focus on. I say, people want to get promoted, students want to get the degree they deserve. So let's create an environment where people can get promoted and people can get the degree they deserve. Let's not focus on, well, do you know what? When I walked in, she asked me to get the tea because I'm black. No, let's focus on, she wants to get promoted. What are we going to do in the university to make sure she gets the promotion she deserves? Because the moment she gets the promotion she deserves, people are going to stop asking her to get the tea. So I focus on that. Let's focus on making sure that students that are coming and paying between £9,000 and £24,000 a year get the degree they deserve. And not that, the student was walking down the corridor and they say, you need to go around the back. Because if you make sure that everybody is focused on that one thing around progression and attainment, then everybody knows that it's not about what he said, she said. It's not about the fact that you walk in and you get a funny look. It's none of those things. Everybody in their career, you walk into a room in the beginning, you're the only person there who's not white, you're the only woman there. You really have to check it at the door, go in and be super, super good at what you're doing. Sometimes it's difficult. Then you phone a friend. What would you do about this? And that person is outraged. I remember my daughter started working in a place and she's, a bit like me, a bit gobby. And she had another guy who was a bit gentle and everything. And every time they sat down for a meeting, her boss would say, can you get the tea? Blah, blah. So one day she had witnessed this too often. She went into the kitchen and said, why are you always getting the tea? Are you the tea person? Can you stop it? So she actually told him. And I remember I've also been in a situation like that. I took her lead. We were at a table and a woman got up. It was a leadership meeting, so we're all leaders. A woman got up and said, I'm just going to get some tea. Would you like some? And I'm like, no, I'll follow you and get mine. As she was walking away, a bloke turned to her and said, can you get me a glass of water? When we got to the tea station, I said, why on earth couldn't he get it himself? Well, you know what? She was hostile towards me as if mind your own business. But I'd done my work. If you witness microaggressions, dive right in, straight away. Yeah, this happened between white man, white woman. But I still dived in and said, why don't you tell him to get the tea and to get his own water? You know, my daughter rushing out saying, stop getting the tea for God's sake. You're making us all look bad.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I guess sometimes you do need to be self-aware and understand that you can actually say something. And I think that's a very important characteristic. The next issue I just wanted to touch on actually before we close off these discussions and actually having this episode, we're hoping that we can also bring awareness to many people in their organization and institutions about, you know, some of the discussions that are obviously ongoing. But we're also interested in having people either reach out to their organizations where they can possibly do something or participate in some of the changes that might be going on in the organization. But what I've also realized is that a lot of people in organizations are also not aware of what their organization institutions are doing. So I think it's something that I think would be important to have that awareness in the organizations, that people can actually reach out to, you know, whatever BAME networks that are in there and can participate and contribute to changes that people want to see and get the results that people want to see. And so this brings me to, you know, just maybe you could just give us a brief, Sahar, on, you know, you've worked a lot on the Athena Swan, and, you know, congratulations on the award. And you also talked about working on the race charter and so forth. Are there some lessons from working on the Athena Swan that you could take, that you could use on working on the race charter?
Yeah, so this is the Race at Work Charter, so it's not the Race Equality Charter because you work on the REC. It's slightly different. We're not eligible to the Race Equality Charter because we're a research institution. But yes, absolutely, there's lots of lessons that we can transfer in terms of the way that we have approached the Athena Swan work. And I think communication is key. And I also think engagement, but also engagement at all levels. I think it's really powerful in terms of having staff engagement groups and the more of the sort of like grassroots approach. And I think this is really important. This is where we can sort of see activism with a small a, sort of trying to sort of like drive positive change. And I think that is so important. But also I feel that there has to be, like, the leadership piece is key as well, in terms of leaders confidently leading this agenda around EDI and valuing it as much as they are valuing other parts of the leadership role as well. So I think it's a multi-pronged approach. I think about celebrating success, and I absolutely agree that sometimes there's lots of work going on, but actually people are not necessarily aware of all of the work that is happening, and actually just being more visible and also reaching out more proactively to people as well. So the burden shouldn't be on people to try and find out about information, but actually being more visible. And I think engagement and communication is key. And I suppose we should talk about metrics as well in terms of measuring progress. With gender, we do have data for gender, so we can cut the data any which way you want to because we have that. But with ethnicity, we don't have all of the data within our HR systems. We're trying to build that up. That is important, but also the individual stories are very important and can be very powerful as well. We shouldn't use data as an excuse not to be doing things, but they can just be used as a mechanism to leverage activity rather than being, okay, until we've got all the data on this, we're not going to do anything. It shouldn't be a barrier. It should just sort of enhance approaches, I think.
That's great. And do you feel that this should be incentivized? So for Athena Swan, I think there are some incentives that organizations can get, funding incentives. Do you feel that, you know, work on race inequality or issues should be incentivized as well?
It's an interesting question, actually. So Athena Swan, so one of the funders, the NIHR funding agency, has linked Athena Swan Silver accreditation with its application. So the other funders haven't done that. And just reading a statement from the new chief executive of UKRI, Ottilie Lace, I think she's saying that she won't be linking Athena Swan to grant processes. In order for these programs to work, it has to be more than a tick box exercise. And I think sometimes by making it too strongly linked to a process, it could have a detrimental effect. And what we have seen with Athena Swan is the burden ends up disproportionately falling on early women researchers. So actually, they end up doing all of the work for the Athena Swan, which will then have an impact on the research that they are doing. And we just need to be mindful of that with our race equity work as well, actually, that it isn't sort of like falling on people who are being disadvantaged by the processes and systems anyway. And, it is being supported properly at an institutional level. I think that's what I would emphasise. In processes, I think we should absolutely be collecting data. So if we put in a grant application, I think the funders should be looking at the data, demographic data. But I think also we should be supported to include equality, diversity, inclusion statements within those processes as well. So actually, it isn't just about numbers, it's actually about what are you doing to make sure that you're building an inclusive programme, or you're ensuring that you're going to build an inclusive, diverse team.
And Ijeoma?
I was going to say that I have a slightly different view. So I have a role in UCL. I'm the Provost Envoy for Race Equality. And what you've seen from Athena Swan with the NIHR saying that you need to have this Athena Swan award in order to put your applications in. You've seen lots of people then trying to get these Athena Swan badges. On their own, they don't do anything. Even the Race Equality Charter on its own is not going to do anything for you, but it starts the conversation. So I remember what we did when we looked at women leaders at UCL. We went to the leadership team and said, look, 87% of the heads of departments are male. It's about 50-50 when it comes to academics of each gender. And the reason they're male is that we don't follow our own processes. People are tapped up in the pub or in a corridor and told, you absolutely have to lead. I'm stepping down. It's now your job. Instead of having an interview and a proper process. We pointed this out to the leadership. In one cycle, we went from 1 in 6 women being leaders to 1 in 4. In one cycle, one academic year. And that's because now women applied, understanding that they're going to have a fair process. Having the Athena Swan as the backdrop and saying, look, we're deficient in this particular metric, and going on and making it quite humorous. Well, hang on a minute, you can tap Dave 1 can pass on to Dave 2, Dave 3, Dave 4, or you let someone else in who's equally, I would say, endowed, but feels that they don't see themselves in that role, because ever since they've been in the department, it's been a Dave that's been heading the department. So that's why that really works. With the Race Equality Charter, I believe that if the UKRI or NIHR said, once you have this award, you can submit your applications or you'll get additional points if you do. The reason why it's important is that many voices, diverse voices, and there's evidence everywhere, produce better outcomes. There's evidence from juries, there's evidence from the McKinsey report, looking at line management roles in women, companies are more profitable, looking at ethnic minority participation in boards, those companies are more profitable. These are companies on the stock exchange. So there is lots of data that shows that when you have diverse opinions, making key decisions, you have better outcomes. Even citations. If you have multi-ethnicity authors, you have more cites. And this is important because sometimes things are overlooked. Look at the COVID-19 crisis and the impact on BAME communities. That would have been known ahead of time if we have multiple voices researching respiratory illness, multiple voices researching how illness impacts on different ethnicities. But that data doesn't appear. And so suddenly we have coffins piling up in the BAME community and fewer coffins piling up in the other community. In the UK, we have top universities. In the global top 10 of universities, we've got about 4 universities there. Your institution is probably the best in the world, Sahar. So we've got all these amazing people, but nevertheless, there was a key blind spot. That's because you don't have diverse voices making decisions and doing the research. So absolutely, Ottiline Leyser is wrong. It should be part of the process.
The next question I was going to ask you was really, what is effective? But you've told me so many things that are really interesting in order to start seeing a difference, to start making a difference. What is the most effective thing in addressing race inequality in academia or research institutions?
Follow the money. Let the money be determined by how much you pay attention to diversity and inclusion. So when it comes to the Office for Students and your access agreement, when it comes to research funding, when it comes to incentives for managers, look at what they're doing in EDI and say, well, hang on. Yeah, you're going to get many points in the ref for all these great papers and for all this great money you're getting. But hey, if you're doing EDI, you're also going to get some points, which translate into pounds. Follow the money. Once the money is linked to this thing, you and I are out of business, thank God.
You have anything else to add, Sahar?
I think it's very powerful what Ijeoma was saying, and I wouldn't argue with that really. But I think education and empowerment. So 2 words.
Wow. Well, this has been really, really enjoyable. I have so many other questions to ask both of you, but unfortunately, we've run out of time. And hopefully we can continue these discussions in other fora, I'm sure there'll be many other opportunities to tap into all the expertise and knowledge from Ijeoma and yourself, Sahar. So we're looking forward to continuing to interact and work with you. Just to, wrap up, what are the 3 take-home messages for everyone, for our audience today?
I think reaching out to people, you will find some fantastic allies. If you are thinking about your next steps, talking to someone, perhaps a little bit more than mentorship, perhaps sort of more along the lines of sponsorship, but as a starting point, I think people would be happy to talk. We should also lead by example. We've been talking a little bit about, say, microaggressions, what happens in meetings, but also, we should be making sure that we are being as inclusive as we can be. And we all have our own sorts of spheres of influence as well. So making sure that, we are also setting a positive example. Listening, I think listening is really important as well. And people can have quite different experiences and not making assumptions about people's experiences.
For me, I think the first thing to bear in mind is that life is hard. Once you understand that life is hard and being successful is hard, then you prepare yourself for the disappointment. Then the other thing to bear in mind is that if you are reaching, you will be disappointed, because that's the way you grow. But when you don't get it, feedback, very important. So always ask for feedback, because feedback, as I said, 2 problems. It tells them that you're a troublemaker. You're not going to go away quietly. It also helps you grow. And then if I was thinking about the 3rd thing, I've got lots of things, but I think that there should be a rethink around the way we understand that when there's diversity, we have better outcomes. People have been saying it for years, but still it's as if it's not believed. When there's diversity, you have better outcomes, because you see the problem from multiple perspectives. And you look at the evidence when you want to make a decision. If you have diversity, you consider the evidence. You don't consider dogma. So I think that understanding life is hard, always asking for personal feedback, and also for society to value the fact that when you have diversity and inclusion, you have better outcomes.
Wow. Then we have a lot to think about, and we definitely have learned a lot today. So thank you both. It's been really enjoyable.
I'd just like to thank Sahar and Ijeoma for coming on the show and giving us food for thought. As always, all the information on the guests, including where to find them, can be found in the description box. Please follow us on Twitter at mentor_podcast. That's mentor_podcast, where we'll let you know when new episodes are released. You can listen to us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and SoundCloud by searching for Your Digital Mentor Podcast. Please send your comments and questions to inquiries@yourdigimentor.net. That's inquiries@yourdigimentor.net. As always, please remember to tell people about us, and see you in a week or so.
This episode is supported by Advanced Courses in Scientific Conferences, a program which develops and delivers training and conferences that span basic research, cutting-edge biomedicine, and application of genomics in healthcare. Through engaging and networking, the events educate, inspire, and transform careers worldwide.
This episode is also supported by the Wellcome Sanger Institute. It undertakes large-scale research that forms the foundations of knowledge in biology and medicine. It uses the power of genome sequencing to understand and harness the information in DNA. The Sanger's discoveries are used to improve health and to understand life on Earth.
This episode is also supported by social entrepreneurship to spur health. The SESH Group uses crowdsourcing to enhance health and health research with a focus on low and middle income countries.